Hi everyone. I am presenting this work on behalf of my colleague Jacob Rogers, who is unable to be here today, and also the next lead after Jacob, Eva Plaganyi, who's also unable to be here today. Jacob is online though, so he's probably best placed to answer most questions, but I'll endeavour to do my best and also to try and represent the work that he has been leading over the last couple of years. So again, this work also forms part of the COTS-coral innovation program. We've just heard from Gabby and from Cam before then. Before I begin, just really to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're currently meeting on, and pay respects to sort of elders past, present and emerging. So as you're all fully aware, we are dealing with a very large ecosystem, the Great Barrier Reef. It extends just under 350,000 square kilometers, more than about 3,000 individual reefs, and there are possibly hundreds of thousands of starfish on any given reef. And starfish are culled individually. So there's this big mismatch of scale. We have limited resources to be able to do this, and they don't match the scale of the reef. So how do we maximize the impact with what we've got? So I'm going to be talking about a reef-scale model that we've developed to sort of look at the efficacy of the COTS-coral program. The main objective of this program is to limit coral loss due to predation by COTS themselves. And the work that Jacob has been leading has sort of, looked at this in different ways. The first was to think about these ecological thresholds that sort of underpin those cull per unit effort targets, and refine these by, sort of considering sort of local factors, things like different coral growth rates, which we know might vary across the GBR, and due to other impacts like climate change. Also to evaluate the relative performance of different intervention strategies for COTS control, and this specifically is not at a regional scale that I'm talking about, but rather at sort of a management site scale. And then also characterize when or where different interventions might be most effective in limiting COTS impacts at these sites. So the ecological modelling approach that Jacob has used, and one that I've worked on as well elsewhere, is these things called MICE models, or models of intermediate complexity for ecosystem assessment. Essentially, they try and find that sweet spot in the modelling world of complexity. So between really simple models that might just consider, one or two species, to these really whole of ecosystem models that are really complex in the number of species and the parameters that they contain. The nice thing about these MICE models is that they're custom designed to the ecosystem that they are, that we're targeting. They just focus on sort of those key components of a system. They are fitted to data, and they use sort of, I guess, statistical fitting techniques and different ways of sort of, identifying your best modeling, sort of your best model to try and be able to then also address some of these management questions. They can also have, sort of the environmental impacts included into them. They can have human dimensions brought in as well, and they can account for a range of uncertainties too. These MICE models are sort of not really a new approach. They have been around for a while. They've been used in different systems, for example, to try and better understand the impacts of harvesting water from rivers on downstream fisheries and ecosystems in the Gulf of Carpentaria. They've been used to better understand changes in temperate reef ecosystems in the South Atlantic. They've also been used to better understand climate change on recovery of baleen whales in the Southern Ocean. So without going into sort of the details of this actual model itself, this is really just a snapshot of what's in there. We have sort of some background recruitment that comes into the model, and is then sort of, we have this age-structured COTS component, and two different coral components, sort of a slow-growing, less preferred coral, like your prioritised species, and then this fast-growing, more preferred for COTS things like your acropora species. And we have sort of different interactions between the COTS and the coral themselves, and these feedback loops as well. Things like prey switching when your preferred coral cover declines and that sort of thing. We can also account for external, impacts, things like your cyclones, coral bleaching as well. And importantly, what this model is founded on is that it's fitted to these data. So we bring in things like your cull data, your dive time, your catch per unit effort, your total number of COTS that are culled, and total coral cover. So the model is validated on past data and then is used to sort of compare different scenarios. Some of the early work that Eva Plaganyi led was sort of defining these ecological thresholds. She did this using a steady state analysis, which took a version of this mice model and really looked at, okay, where is this equilibrium point where coral growth is balanced by the amount of coral eaten? Coral growth is balanced by the amount of coral eaten, and where we find that there's that no change in coral, what are the number of COTS that are, allowing for that equilibrium state? And that can be then converted into this sort of expected catch per unit effort or cull per unit effort that we would want from that reef. Jacob's work's then gone on to sort of refine this a bit and has looked at, okay, how might these control targets change depending on sort of geographical area or different impacts of climate change. So thinking about, in this case, he used an example of if coral growth increased or decreased, how might we expect these ecological targets to change? So he modeled differences in growth rate of the corals relative to the original threshold. And if you look at all those sort of pretty colored curvy lines on that plot on the right, that's really just showing the different points of equilibrium for those different growth rates. And really what we found was those equilibrium points were quite similar under different coral growth rates for lower levels of coral cover, but not necessarily, it was slightly more nuanced when you got to higher levels of coral cover, and it really depended then on what sort of your objectives were. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of that contour plot on the left there, but it is in a paper that's in review at the moment and will be part of that CSIP report that comes out in about 6 weeks' time. But what he found was that under different growth rates, it really, it made little difference as to what that catch per unit effort threshold was for coral cover up to about 40%. And that difference was really, really small when you had those low levels of coral cover, sort of less than 1 COTS per dive. And that typically the current thresholds that are being used are pretty robust to different coral growth rates for that lower scale of coral cover. This sort of aligned with other work that Jacob had previously done, where he found that the current thresholds, were better than using sort of more or sort of lower threshold targets. The next thing that we looked at was, can management improve coral recovery under outbreaking conditions? Sorry, this is actually Jacob's previous work, not part of the CSIP project, but really what he was looking at, if we simulate these outbreak conditions using a mice model and we run these different management scenarios, do we see a difference in which scenario might perform better in terms of coral cover and catch per unit effort? So some of the scenarios he had was sort of that, no control, you do nothing, versus you have sort of some strategic control or versus a random control, or you use these thresholds to help dictate where about you're going to perform that control and across different voyage intervals. So if we look at the plots over here, the top left plot just shows the difference in coral cover, and the bottom is that the COTS catch rate. And what he found was that frequent voyages were best, so if you had to go sort of every 2 weeks compared to every 10 weeks. And these frequent voyages were able to reduce the COTS faster back to non-outbreak levels, sort of 2 to 4 years earlier than if you had not been doing frequent voyages. And that's these threshold-based approaches were better placed by using, the latest information than rather going for some sort of random site selection or a strategic site selection. And this sort of one of the spin-offs of this work was, sort of coming to the notion of what's now sort of commonly known, I guess, as these effort sinks, is that a reef or site that's using up a lot of time that then can't be used elsewhere. And there are various reasons for this, one of them being limited resources, others that there might just be lots of COTS on that reef, or there might be sort of these low coral or CPU targets that divers are trying to achieve. And then just lastly, just to talk about some of the other work that he's been doing is to evaluate control efficacy at the site level. So this work sort of looked at the historical approach of control, sort of I think it was 2018 versus this decision tree approach. The left-hand graph just shows the relative change in coral cover, the average change, and the right-hand graph there is sort of the median of that. And really what he found was that the decision tree approach sort of consistently outperformed that historical approach, and up to about 70% of more coral was saved per minute, plus the number of dive hours used was a lot less under the decision tree approach. It was also more consistent across sites, and it might have greater risk to sort of things like these bleaching events, and that's really just because there's more coral that has been saved, and so then there's more coral that could be lost under bleaching. He's also taken this another step further and added in new data, and has sort of doubled the number of reefs that he now fits the data to, and a lot more sites, and has compared sort of the actual control that's used versus no control, and found that there's been a consistent improvement in coral saved per year, up to about sort of 8% on average saved across sites over sort of about 3 years. So what does this mean for management? Because I think at the end of the day, that's really, what we're interested is what implications does the research have for the management. So I guess just to summarize that uncontrolled scenarios led to lower coral cover compared to controlled scenarios. The current thresholds have found to be fairly robust to variation in coral growth rates. And that these threshold-based approaches performed better than just randomly selecting sites. And then, again, it comes down to what are the objectives. You may need to consider why is a reef prioritized, and possibly when you might not want to attempt controlling a reef. And then also that removing the most COTS doesn't necessarily translate into the most or the best outcomes for coral. And you need to consider both where COTS are recruiting to and where the coral will benefit most. And so far the mice model suggests that this can vary even within a single reef. But because these models are sort of integrated and take into account both coral and COTS at the same time, these tools can help sort of find those nuances and pinpoint to that. I think I'll leave it there. There are some other next steps, but I'm not going to go into those. And thanks very much.
Any questions for Laura? Yes, please.
If I'm allowed another question.
You are.
With the mouse models, how do you assess where you are in that curve, whether you're too simple or too complex?
That's a very good question. I think it comes down to we have sort of a structured, I guess, framework approach of I think a mice review paper was put out in about 2014 that provides some of those guidelines. We generally in mice is looking at sort of no more than 10 species, and it's a trade-off between the more species and the more parameters, and you've got to parameterize. So there's no one size fits all in terms of what that actually is, but it's really just identifying what are the critical species in that system that we have a question surrounding, and do we also have data for that? So there are a few things to consider, and sort of we use a stepwise approach just to sort of try and find where that sweet spot is, noting that it's not just one point, there's probably some sort of, I guess, variation around where that might be.
Thank you, Laura. All right, next we have Alejandro Astor.